Okay guys, let's see how we can use Jaeger in order to trace if there are some problems in our applications which are distributed using the microservices approach. So here I've created two services, API service and DB service, and they are quite simple. Basically, we have a server.js in the API service that's using Express and has a health checkpoint, as well as it allows to post to certain URL and to get certain URL. When we're posting to an URL, we're using Axios, and actually we are posting to another service, this DB service, and we're performing an insertion of one record, then we're catching for errors, and that's basically for this post URL. For the get URL, again, we are Axios, we are making get requests towards the data URL, and we're returning as a JSON the data response. Our application is listening on port 3000, and because we are using WSL, we are binding to the universal 0.0.0.0 IP address. And let's see the DB service now. Here we are using MongoDB in order to perform database operations. We are creating my database, and then we are creating my collection. When we have requests on the data URL, it's parsed by Express on port 3001. The handler is accessing my collection and inserting a record. Of course, we are passing as an information in our request what to insert as a record. And if everything is all right, we are returning JSON with a successful result. If there are problems, we are catching the errors and we are returning JSON with the error message. For the get endpoint, when we are receiving a get request, again, we are accessing the same collection. And we're trying to find everything that we have in our database and returning the results as a JSON. Again, we're checking for errors and displaying with status 500 if there are such. Now, both of the services, DB service and API service, they are wrapped and they have a Docker file. Their Docker files are very similar. Basically, we're using Node Alpine image. We're installing everything that is contained in the package.json via npm install inside of the container. We're copying our source code directly inside of the container, and we are running the server.js via Node. Absolutely the same Docker file we have for the DB service. The only difference between them is that the API service is exposing the port 3000 and the DB service is exposing port 3001. If we return to the API service inside of its servers.js, we might notice that we're using this tracing.js file and we are telling it to trace the API service, and also we're using trace from OpenTelemetry APIs. And that's in order to be able to insert tracing in our REST APIs. For example, in the post, we are creating one span, which is called create item, and we're using this tracer API service. And then inside of the span, we are setting statuses if everything is all right. And if we have error, we set some codes and messages inside of the status. And finally, we are ending this trace. So that's how we generate trace. For get request or the get API, we do the same. And there is also this tracing.js file, which is a little bit longer. So we are setting an exporter. We're setting up our endpoint with the specific port here. And we are listing later in order to observe the code execution. Here are different instrumentations for the file system, for Express, HTTP, and MongoDB that they are enabled for the last three. So that's for the tracing. Thing is that everything runs within a Docker compose file, and here we have different services. As you can see, Jaeger, MongoDB, DB service, and API service. So for the MongoDB, we are just loading up the Mongo image, and we create one volume pointing to DataDB here on the local machine. Then for the DB service is here we are setting up different environmental variables where our MongoDB will be located and some other needed exports for the Jaeger in order to create its traces. And this is under WSL. I've just used the host mod networking to simplify the things. And that's the DB service. The API service is similar. Again, the environmental variables. We have some context for the build or the Docker file. And again, setting up network mode. And now the Jaeger, again, we're passing some environmental variables, the protocol for the collector, and the image from which Jaeger will load up its service. And now let's try to run all those together. I'm using Podman here, so I can just type Podman, compose up, and I would like to rebuild if there are changes to the containers. And of course, we have quite verbose output, but let's say that our services are started and running okay. And now we can try to hit the health endpoints. Okay, this is for port 3001. Let's see now in the logs what we have. From the DB service, we have health checkpoint endpoint hit on port 3000. We should be able to see again status okay. This is coming from the API service this time. So they are working, and this time we will try to do something more elaborate to send a post request. So we will send name, test, and value towards the localhost 3000 API items. And we see success true and the inserted ID of the document. Now, if we check the logs, we see creating a new item from the API service and a received post request. Basically, the DB service is receiving the request from the API service and then inserted document. So everything went well. The services are communicating between each other. And now let's open up the Jaeger interface. Okay, this is on localhost. And we see here that our API service is exposed. So we can find all kind of traces that have been emitted. We see several times we have post requests and one get request. So this is our health request, and here we can actually follow now what happened when we try to reach this health endpoint. So first is our query, then the Express is being in it, JSON parser took it, and now we are handling this request. And of course, if you are interested, you can debug more where those requests are coming. And as you can see, some of them are taking longer time than the others. So if we go, for example, for the post request, as you can see, we're entering directly to create item. And actually create item is our span part of the trace. So the span is the building block of the trace, and one trace can consist of multiple spans. So this is our create item, and we can easily see that we are hitting this part and how long does it take to us. And then the next is when we're making the post request and initiating post request and how long again this has taken us. Of course, this is quite simple example. You can put way more debugging into this, as well as different services such as Ingress and others. And when you have multiple services which are communicating between each other, Jaeger can help you to discover if there are certain bugs occurring and where they are just by looking at those graphs. So play around with it. It's quite powerful and it's helpful not only for developers but for the DevOps. Okay, guys, thank you for watching this video. If you find it useful, you can subscribe to the channel for more of the kind.